The fabric ripped with a sound so loud it silenced the entire foyer, and Alara Whitmore felt the cool night air touch her bare shoulder before she even understood what had happened. For a moment, nobody moved. Priscilla still had a fistful of torn ivory silk in her hand. Margaret stood frozen beside her, eyes wide, as if she could not believe what her sister had just done. Lady Constance stood at the top of the staircase, her lips pressed into a thin line that was not quite a smile and not quite disapproval either. Alara looked down at her gown. The shoulder seam had torn clean away from the bodice, exposing the delicate lace beneath. It was her mother's dress, the only thing she had left of her. "You did that on purpose," Alara said, her voice steady despite the way her hands were shaking. "You should not have tried to outshine us," Priscilla said, tossing the torn scrap of fabric to the floor as though it meant nothing. "Did you really think you could walk into a royal ball dressed like that and be welcomed?" Margaret said nothing. She simply looked away toward the tall windows where the carriage lanterns glowed in the darkness outside. Alara had known, from the moment she found her mother's gown hidden in the attic trunk, that her stepsisters would not let her attend the ball without a fight. She had not expected them to destroy the one thing that made her feel like herself again. 3 years had passed since her father, Edmund Whitmore, a respected merchant with ships that sailed to every port along the coast, had died from a sudden fever. In those 3 years, Alara had gone from being the cherished daughter of a prosperous household to something closer to a servant in her own home. Lady Constance, her father's second wife, had wasted no time rearranging the household to favor her own daughters. The good rooms went to Priscilla and Margaret. The fine dresses went to Priscilla and Margaret. The warm seat by the fire in winter went to Priscilla and Margaret. Alara was given the attic room, the one with the sloped ceiling and the drafty window that never quite closed. She was given chores instead of lessons, mending instead of music, and silence instead of comfort. She had learned, slowly and painfully, not to expect anything different. But when the royal messenger arrived 2 weeks earlier with news of the Duke's ball, something in Alara had refused to stay quiet any longer. The messenger had read the invitation aloud in the drawing room, his voice formal and clear. Every unmarried woman of standing in the region was invited to attend a grand ball at Ashbourne Manor, hosted by Duke Alastair Ashbourne himself. It was, the messenger explained, the Duke's first public event in nearly 5 years, ever since the death of his parents had left him to manage the dukedom alone at a young age. Rumor said he had grown cold and distant, uninterested in society, uninterested in marriage. But his advisors had convinced him it was time to open the doors of Ashbourne Manor once again. The guest list, the messenger said, had been drawn from the official registry of the county, a registry that included every family of standing, no matter their current circumstances. And there, still listed under her father's name, was Alara Whitmore. Lady Constance had gone pale when she heard the name read aloud. She had tried, quietly and quickly, to have it struck from the list, sending a letter to the estate office requesting a correction. But the office had replied that the registry was legal record, drawn from property and title, and could not simply be altered because a stepmother wished it so. Alara Whitmore was, whether Lady Constance liked it or not, still entitled to attend. From that moment, the household had become a battlefield of quiet cruelty. Extra chores appeared each morning before Alara had even finished the ones from the day before. Meals grew smaller. Sharp words grew sharper. Priscilla and Margaret took turns reminding her, in every possible way, that she did not belong among people of real standing anymore, no matter what a piece of paper said. Alara endured it the way she endured everything, with her chin lifted and her thoughts kept carefully to herself. She had learned that giving her stepfamily a reaction only fed their cruelty. Silence, she had discovered, was armor. But silence could not protect a torn dress. She had found her mother's gown 3 nights before the ball, tucked beneath old linens in a trunk that Lady Constance had forgotten to have cleared out. The ivory silk had yellowed slightly with age, and the hem had frayed in places, but Alara recognized it instantly. It was the gown her mother had worn to her own wedding, the same gown she had worn again years later to a summer gala that Alara, only 7 at the time, still remembered in fragments. The warmth of candlelight. the sound of her mother's laughter, the feeling of being loved without condition. For 3 nights, after her chores were finished and the house had gone quiet, Alara had worked by candlelight to repair the gown. She had no formal training in dressmaking, but she had watched the household seamstress for years before her father's death, and her fingers remembered more than she expected. She took in the waist where it had grown loose with age. She reinforced the seams. She replaced a missing row of pearl buttons with one she found in her mother's old sewing box, still kept safe beneath her bed where Lady Constance had never thought to look. By the 3rd night the gown was ready. It was not the newest fashion, not the kind of gown Priscilla and Margaret would be wearing, covered in ribbons and jewels bought with money that had once belonged to Alara's father. But it was real. It was hers. It carried her mother's memory in every stitch, and for the first time in 3 years, Alara had looked in the mirror and seen someone who mattered. That was the gown Priscilla had just torn apart in the foyer. "Fix it if you can," Priscilla said, stepping past Alara toward the front door, where the family carriage was already waiting. "Or better yet, stay home where you belong. Nobody at that ball wants to see a Whitmore dressed in rags." Margaret lingered a moment longer, and for just a heartbeat, something like guilt flickered across her face. Then Lady Constance called her name from the top of the stairs, sharp and impatient, and Margaret turned and hurried up to join her mother. "We are leaving," Lady Constance said, looking down at Alara with an expression that held no warmth at all. "I suggest you use this evening to reflect on your place in this household." The front door closed. The carriage wheels crunched against the gravel outside, growing fainter as it rolled away into the night. And then the house was silent, except for the sound of Alara's own breathing. She stood alone in the foyer, torn silk hanging from her shoulder, candlelight flickering against the tall windows. She could feel the old, familiar urge rising in her chest, the urge to sit down on the cold floor and let herself cry until there was nothing left. It would have been easy. It would have been, in some strange way, a relief. But instead, Alara looked down at the torn fabric, at her mother's careful stitching still holding strong beneath the damage, and something inside her hardened into resolve. She was not going to let this be the end of the evening. She was not going to let 3 years of quiet cruelty win on the one night that had finally offered her a door out into the world. She walked slowly to the small mirror hanging near the staircase and studied her reflection. The tear ran from her shoulder down toward the bodice, exposing more than she would have liked, but not indecently so. The rest of the gown, the parts her stepsisters had not managed to touch, still held its shape, still caught the candlelight in a soft, warm glow that reminded her so much of her mother that it made her chest ache. She thought of her father, of the way he used to tell her that true worth was never found in silk or jewels, but in the strength a person carried inside themselves. She thought of her mother, laughing in this very gown, unafraid of what anyone thought of her. And she thought of herself, standing here in this cold, empty house, with a choice in front of her that no one else could make. She could stay. She could accept what her step-family wanted for her, fade quietly into the background of a life that was never meant to be this small. Or she could go. Alara turned from the mirror and walked quickly up the stairs, her heart pounding with something that felt, for the first time in a long while, less like fear and more like determination. She did not have time to properly mend the tear, not before the ball would begin, but she had something else. A shawl, plain and gray, tucked away in the back of her wardrobe, forgotten by everyone but her. It would not hide the damage completely, but it might be enough to get her through the door. As she wrapped it around her shoulders, she caught her reflection once more in the small mirror above her wash basin. Her eyes, tired but steady, stared back at her. She thought of the invitation still sitting on the writing desk downstairs, her name written in careful, formal script. Alara Whitmore, not a servant, not a shadow in someone else's household. A guest, entitled by law and by birth to walk through the doors of Ashbourne Manor tonight. She was not going to let anyone take that from her, not even her own stepsisters. Downstairs, she found the family's old walking boots, sturdy enough for the long road ahead, since the only carriage in the household had already left without her. It would take hours to walk to Ashbourne Manor, hours she did not have if she wanted to arrive before the ball's opening dances concluded. But she had made up her mind, and there was no version of tonight where she simply stayed behind and let her stepfamily win. She gathered the torn edges of her mother's gown as best she could, pinned them with what little she had, and pulled the gray shawl tightly around her shoulders. She took one last look at the house that had never truly felt like home since her father's passing, blew out the remaining candles, and stepped out into the cold night air. The road to Ashbourne Manor stretched long and dark ahead of her, lit only by scattered moonlight breaking through the clouds. Somewhere at the end of that road was a ballroom full of people who would judge her the moment she walked through the doors, torn dress and all. But somewhere at the end of that road, too, was a chance. A chance to be seen, not as a stepdaughter cast aside, not as a servant in her own home, but as Elara Whitmore, daughter of a man who had once believed she could do anything she set her mind to. She lifted her chin, tightened her shawl against the chill, and began to walk. Behind her, the house grew smaller and smaller in the darkness, until it disappeared entirely from view. Ahead of her, though she could not yet see it through the trees, the lights of Ashbourne Manor were just beginning to glow against the night sky, warm and golden, like a promise she intended to keep. She did not know, as she walked that lonely road with her torn gown and her unbroken spirit, that somewhere inside those golden lights, a man who had spent 5 years hiding from the world was about to have his own quiet certainties shaken to their core. She did not know that this single, painful night, the night her stepsisters had tried to destroy, was about to become the night everything in her life began to change. All she knew, with each determined step she took toward Ashbourne Manor, was that she refused to disappear. And for Elara Whitmore, after 3 long years of silence, that refusal was enough to carry her all the way to the Duke's door. The road narrowed as it left the edge of town, curving between tall hedgerows that blocked most of the moonlight. Elara kept her pace steady, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She had walked this road before, years ago in the back of her father's carriage, watching the countryside slide by through a window while her mother hummed softly beside her. It felt strange to walk it now on foot, alone, in a torn gown hidden beneath a plain shawl. She passed a small stream where the water ran fast over smooth stones, and she paused just long enough to splash a little onto her face, cooling the heat that had built up from walking so quickly. Her boots were already damp from the wet grass at the roadside, but she did not slow down. Every minute she spent resting was a minute the ball continued without her, and she was determined not to miss her chance entirely. A cart rumbled up behind her, pulled by a single tired horse, and Elara stepped aside to let it pass. Instead, the driver, an older man with a kind, weathered face, pulled the reins and brought the cart to a stop beside her. "You are walking awfully far this late, miss," the man said, studying her with open curiosity. "Are you headed toward the manor by chance?" "I am delivering barrels of cider for the celebration myself." Elara hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, I'm afraid my carriage left without me." The man, whose name she soon learned was Nathaniel, gave a short laugh, though not unkindly. "Well, that seems a poor way to treat a guest of the Duke's ball. Climb up if you like. I cannot promise it is comfortable, but it will get you there faster than your own 2 feet. Elara climbed onto the cart, grateful beyond words, and settled herself carefully among the wooden barrels. As the cart rolled forward, Nathaniel glanced at her once or twice, taking in the torn shoulder of her gown, the pinned fabric, the plain shawl that did little to hide the damage. He said nothing about it directly, but after a while he reached behind his seat and produced an old woolen blanket, offering it to her without a word. "For the cold," he said simply. "The nights grow sharp this time of year." Elara accepted it gratefully, wrapping it over her shoulders atop the shawl. It smelled faintly of hay and leather, nothing like the fine perfumes her stepsisters wore, but it was warm, and in that moment warmth mattered more than elegance. "You are very kind," she said. Nathaniel shrugged. "My daughter is about your age. If she ever needed help on a cold road, I would hope someone would offer it to her." He paused, then added, "Family trouble, I take it." Alara looked out at the passing hedgerows, unsure how much to say to a stranger. But something about the quiet honesty of the night, the emptiness of the road, made her want to speak the truth for once, instead of swallowing it the way she always did at home. "My stepsisters tore my gown before I could leave," she admitted. "They did not want me to attend tonight." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice remained gentle. "Then it is a good thing you did not let them win." They rode in comfortable silence after that, the cart creaking steadily along the road, until at last the trees opened up and Ashbourne Manor came into view. Alara had seen grand houses before, back when her father was alive, and business took them occasionally to the homes of other merchants and minor nobility. But nothing had prepared her for the sight of Ashbourne Manor at night, lit from every window with warm golden light, its long driveway lined with lanterns that flickered like a river of fire leading up to the entrance. Carriages of every size and color were arriving in a steady stream, footmen rushing to open doors, laughter and music spilling out through the tall front windows into the cool night air. Her stomach tightened with nerves. For a moment, the confidence that had carried her this far threatened to crumble entirely. She thought of her torn gown, of the curious stares that would surely follow her the moment she stepped into that glittering hall, and she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Nathaniel must have noticed the hesitation on her face, because he slowed the cart just before the final bend in the road and looked at her with steady, reassuring eyes. "You have come this far," he said. "Do not let fear finish what your stepsisters started." Alara took a deep breath and nodded. He was right. She had not walked miles down a dark, cold road, accepted the kindness of a stranger, and carried her mother's torn gown this close to its destination, only to turn back now out of fear. "Thank you, Nathaniel," she said as the cart finally rolled to a stop near the servants' entrance, where deliveries were being unloaded. "I do not know how I would have gotten here without you." "Go on then," he said, offering her a hand down from the cart. "And miss, whatever waits for you inside those doors, walk in like you belong there, because from where I am sitting it seems to me that you do." Alara handed the blanket back to him, smoothed her shawl over her shoulders as best she could, and turned toward the grand front entrance of Ashbourne Manor, where the golden light and the sound of music grew louder with every step she took. The closer she got, the more she could see the other guests arriving, women in gowns far finer than anything she owned, their hair pinned with jewels, their laughter light and carefree in a way Alara had almost forgotten how to feel. Men in tailored coats offered their arms to escort their companions up the wide stone steps, footmen bowing at the entrance, the warm light spilling out to welcome each new arrival like an old friend. Alara stood at the edge of the driveway for a long moment, watching it all, feeling suddenly very small and very alone. The shawl covering her torn shoulder felt thin and inadequate against the splendor surrounding her. She thought again of turning back, of slipping away into the darkness before anyone noticed her at all. But then she thought of her mother's gown, carefully mended by candlelight, carrying the memory of a woman who had never once let cruelty define her. She thought of her father's voice, calm and certain, telling her that worth was never measured by silk or jewels. She thought of Priscilla's cruel smile as she tore the fabric, of Lady Constance's cold indifference, of the years of silence Alara had swallowed simply to keep the peace in a house that had never truly welcomed her. And she decided, standing there at the edge of the golden light, that she was done swallowing silence. Alara straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin and walked forward. The steps up to the entrance felt longer than the entire road from her stepfamily's house, but she climbed them steadily, refusing to let her legs shake despite the nerves twisting through her stomach. A footman at the top glanced at her, his eyes flicking briefly to the shawl covering her shoulder, but he said nothing, simply bowed and gestured her inside, as protocol required for any guest whose name appeared on the registry. The moment Alara stepped through the doors, the full scale of the ball struck her all at once. The great hall stretched before her, ceilings soaring high above, chandeliers dripping with hundreds of candles that scattered warm light across the polished marble floor. Musicians played from a raised platform at the far end of the room, their melody weaving gracefully beneath the hum of conversation and laughter. Guests moved in elegant clusters, gowns of silk and satin catching the candlelight as they turned and swayed in conversation, jewels glittering at throats and wrists. For a moment, Alara simply stood at the entrance, overwhelmed by the sheer beauty of it all. It had been years since she had witnessed anything so grand, so alive with warmth and color and music. Part of her ached with the memory of a life that had once included evenings like this, before her father's death had stripped it all away. She scanned the crowd instinctively, searching for any familiar face, and quickly spotted Priscilla and Margit near the center of the room, dressed in their finest silks, laughing brightly among a small circle of admirers. Lady Constance stood nearby, speaking with an older woman Alara did not recognize, her posture rigid with the particular pride of a mother, certain her daughters would soon secure advantageous matches. None of them had noticed her yet. Alara was grateful for that small mercy, even as she knew it would not last. She moved carefully along the edge of the room, keeping to the shadows near the tall windows, trying to gather her thoughts before anyone paid her too much attention. She told herself she only needed to survive the evening, to prove to herself that she could walk through these doors despite everything her stepfamily had done to stop her. She did not need to dance. She did not need to be noticed. She simply needed to exist in this space, unbroken, on her own terms. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for Alara Whitmore that night. Across the hall, near the raised dais where the musicians played, Duke Alastair Ashbourne stood partially hidden behind a marble pillar, watching the crowd with the detached patience of a man enduring an obligation rather than enjoying a celebration. He had agreed to host this ball only after months of persistent urging from his closest advisor, Edmund Faircroft, who insisted that the dukedom needed an heir, and that Alastair could not hide behind grief and duty forever. Alastair had spent the better part of the evening exchanging polite, meaningless conversation with a parade of eligible young women, each one presented to him with practiced smiles and rehearsed compliments about his estate, his title, his fortune. None of it interested him. He found himself, more often than not, simply nodding along while his mind wandered elsewhere, toward the quiet solitude of his study, toward the letters and ledgers that made far more sense to him than the elaborate customs of courtship. He was on the verge of retreating to that same quiet corner near the pillar, when a slight movement near the entrance caught his eye. A young woman had just stepped through the tall doors, dressed in a pale ivory gown that seemed, even from a distance, somehow different from the fashionable silks worn by the other guests. She moved carefully, almost cautiously, along the edge of the room, a plain gray shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders despite the warmth of the crowded hall. There was something about the way she carried herself, chin lifted despite the evident nervousness in her steps, that drew Alastair's attention in a way none of the evening's carefully arranged introductions had managed to do. He watched her for a long moment, curiosity sparking somewhere beneath the practiced indifference he had worn like armor for the past 5 years, and he found himself, for the first time that entire evening, genuinely wondering who she was. Alara found a quiet space near one of the tall windows, half hidden by a heavy curtain, and allowed herself a moment to breathe. The music continued to swell around her, warm and lively, and for a brief moment she let herself simply listen, closing her eyes and remembering evenings long past when her father would spin her mother around a smaller, humbler ballroom, laughing as though nothing in the world could ever touch them. She opened her eyes to find a young woman about her own age approaching, dressed in soft blue silk, her expression curious rather than unkind. "I do not believe we have met," the woman said, offering a small, polite smile. "I am Lucy Harrow. My family has an estate 2 villages over." "Alara Whitmore," Alara replied, grateful for the friendly tone. "Whitmore," Lucy repeated thoughtfully. "I remember that name. Your father traded in fine textiles, did he not? My mother always spoke highly of his fabrics." Alara felt a small, unexpected warmth at the mention of her father, at the reminder that his name still carried respect in some corners of the world, even if it had been erased so thoroughly within her own household. "He did," Alara said. "He passed 3 years ago." Lucy's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I am sorry to hear that. It must have been difficult." Her eyes flicked briefly, almost involuntarily, toward the shawl covering Alara's shoulder, but she said nothing further about it, and Alara appreciated the restraint. The two women fell into easy conversation, discussing safe, pleasant topics: the music, the decorations, the impressive size of the manor itself. For the first time all evening, Alara felt herself relax slightly, grateful for a single friendly face in a room otherwise filled with strangers, and somewhere across the hall, the family who had tried so hard to keep her from ever arriving. It was Lucy, in fact, who first noticed the Duke's attention. "He keeps looking this way," Lucy murmured, tilting her head subtly toward the far side of the room. Alara followed her gaze and found herself looking directly at a tall man, standing near the raised platform where the musicians played. He wore a dark, well-tailored coat that set him apart from the more elaborate fashions of the other gentlemen present, and even from this distance, Alara could see the seriousness in his expression, a kind of quiet intensity that seemed out of place amid all the light-hearted laughter surrounding him. "That is the Duke," Lucy said quietly. "Duke Alastair Ashbourne. He has not attended a public event in years, not since his parents passed. Everyone says he is impossibly difficult to please, that he has turned away every young woman his advisors have introduced to him." Alara felt her cheeks warm slightly at the realization that he seemed to be looking directly toward where she and Lucy stood, though she quickly told herself it was surely nothing more than the Duke surveying the crowd of his guests, as any host might do. "He is not looking at us," Alara said, though her voice lacked full conviction. Lucy laughed softly, "Perhaps not at both of us." Before Alara could respond, a sharp voice cut through the pleasant hum of conversation nearby, familiar in a way that made Alara's stomach drop instantly. "Alara, I did not expect to see you here." Priscilla stood a few steps away, her golden gown catching the candlelight beautifully, a cold smile fixed on her lips. Margaret stood just behind her, and a few paces further back, Lady Constance watched with narrowed eyes, her earlier surprise quickly hardening into something far less pleasant. "I told you I would come," Alara said quietly, keeping her voice steady despite the sudden tightness in her chest. "Even after what happened to your gown?" Priscilla asked, her voice pitched just loud enough for a few nearby guests to overhear. "How resourceful of you to find a shawl to hide behind." Lucy, sensing the shift in tone, stepped slightly closer to Alara's side, a silent gesture of support that Alara noticed and appreciated more than words could express. "It was very unfortunate," Alara replied evenly. "What happened to my mother's gown? I am sure whoever tore it will have to answer for it eventually, if not tonight, then someday." A flicker of unease crossed Priscilla's face at the veiled implication, quickly hidden behind another forced smile. "I am sure I do not know what you mean." Lady Constance stepped forward then, her voice low and sharp, meant only for Alara's ears. "You embarrass this family by being here at all, dressed as you are. I suggest you find your way back home before you humiliate yourself further." "I have every right to be here," Alara said, holding her ground despite the trembling she felt beneath her calm exterior. "My name was on the registry. Nothing you did could change that." For a moment, Lady Constance's composure cracked, just slightly, anger flashing hot and quick across her features before she forced it back beneath a mask of icy civility. "We shall see how long that lasts," she said quietly, before turning and sweeping away, Priscilla and Margaret following close behind, though Margaret cast one brief, uncertain glance back over her shoulder before disappearing into the crowd. Lucy exhaled slowly once they were gone. "Well, that was certainly something." Alara laughed despite herself, a short, shaky sound born more from relief than genuine humor. "I am sorry you had to witness that." "Do not apologize," Lucy said firmly. "Family can be complicated. Believe me, I understand more than you might think." She squeezed Alara's arm gently. "Come, Let us find something to drink and perhaps some quieter corner of the room to enjoy the rest of the evening." As they moved through the crowd together, Alara felt the familiar weight of humiliation pressing against her chest, but beneath it, something new had begun to take root as well, something that felt almost like defiance. She had faced her stepfamily directly, in front of witnesses, and she had not backed down. It was a small victory, perhaps, but after 3 years of silence, it felt enormous. She did not notice, as she and Lucy made their way toward the refreshment tables, that Duke Alistair Ashbourne had watched the entire exchange from across the room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail, from the shawl hiding what he now suspected was a damaged gown, to the cold cruelty in the older woman's expression, to the quiet, unshaken dignity with which the young woman in ivory had responded to it all. Alistair had spent 5 years perfecting the art of remaining detached from the endless social performances of the aristocracy, watching countless interactions unfold around him with the same distant curiosity one might reserve for an unfamiliar species of bird. But something about what he had just witnessed refused to settle into that same detached category. He found himself, for the second time that evening, deeply and genuinely curious about the young woman in the torn ivory gown, and this time the curiosity refused to fade. He turned to his advisor, Edmund Faircroft, who stood nearby balancing a glass of wine, and a look of perpetual amusement at his employer's discomfort throughout the evening. "Edmund," Alistair said quietly, "do you know the name of the young woman standing near the far window in the pale gown?" Edmund followed his gaze, eyebrows lifting with unmistakable interest. "I do not, Your Grace, but I would be more than happy to find out." Discreetly, Alistair added. Edmund's smile widened knowingly. "Of course." Discreetly. As Edmund slipped away into the crowd, Alistair remained near the pillar, his eyes drifting once more toward the far side of the hall, where the young woman in ivory stood laughing softly at something her companion had said, her damaged shoulder still carefully hidden beneath a plain gray shawl that seemed entirely out of place among the silks and jewels surrounding her. For reasons he could not quite explain, even to himself, Alistair found that he could not look away. Priscilla was not a woman who accepted defeat quietly, and the humiliation of being outmatched by her own stepsister, in front of witnesses, burned steadily beneath her calm exterior as the evening wore on. She danced twice, laughed loudly at every joke offered by her partners, and accepted compliments on her golden gown with practiced grace, but her eyes kept drifting back across the room, tracking Alara's movements with growing irritation. "She should not be here at all," Priscilla muttered to Margaret as they stood near the refreshment table, watching Alara laugh softly at something her new companion had said. "Look at her, acting as though nothing happened, as though we did not warn her exactly what would come of defying us." Margaret said nothing for a long moment, twisting the stem of her glass between her fingers. "Perhaps we should simply let it go, Priscilla. It is only a shawl. No one seems to have noticed anything is wrong." "That is precisely the problem," Priscilla snapped, her voice low but sharp. "No one has noticed. She managed to hide it. She managed to come here anyway, despite everything, and now she stands there laughing as though we hold no power over her at all." "What would you have us do?" Margaret asked, unease creeping into her voice. "Mother already spoke with her. Surely that is enough." Priscilla's eyes narrowed as an idea began to take shape, cold and calculated. "Not nearly enough," she said quietly. Across the room, Alara remained blissfully unaware of the plotting unfolding near the refreshment tables, too occupied with the pleasant surprise of genuine conversation and unexpected kindness to notice the sharp glances being cast in her direction. Lucy had introduced her to 2 more guests, a soft-spoken gentleman named Peter who spoke passionately about horses, and an older woman named Harriet who told delightful stories about her travels abroad. For the first time in longer than Alara could remember, she felt something close to belonging, something close to the life she had once imagined for herself before her father's death had changed everything. It was during a particularly animated retelling of one of Harriet's travel stories that Alara felt a firm hand grip her shoulder from behind, right at the exact point where the shawl covered her torn gown. "You seem to be enjoying yourself," Priscilla said, her voice pitched to Carrie, a bright, false smile plastered across her face for the benefit of anyone watching. Before Alara could react, before she could even fully process what was happening, Priscilla's fingers tightened and pulled, sharp and sudden, yanking the shawl from Alara's shoulders entirely. The fabric slipped away, exposing the torn seam beneath, the damaged bodice, the pinned edges Alara had done her best to disguise. Gasps rippled outward through the nearby guests as the truth of the damaged gown became visible for all to see. Someone laughed, quick and cruel, quickly stifled but not quickly enough. Whispers began immediately, spreading outward through the crowd like ripples across still water. Alara froze, her hands instinctively rising to cover the exposed tear, humiliation crashing over her in a wave so intense it felt almost physical. The warm, welcoming atmosphere of the ballroom suddenly felt suffocating, every eye in the room seeming to turn toward her at once, every whisper aimed directly at her exposed shoulder, her damaged dress, her obvious poverty laid bare for the entire county to witness. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Priscilla said, feigning surprise, though the satisfaction in her eyes betrayed her completely. "I did not realize your shawl was so loosely tied." Lucy stepped forward immediately, positioning herself protectively beside Alara, but the damage had already been done. The whispers continued to spread, guests turning to murmur behind gloved hands, a few outright staring with expressions ranging from pity to open amusement. Alara felt tears burning at the edges of her eyes, but she refused, with every ounce of willpower she possessed, to let them fall in front of this crowd, in front of her stepsisters who would surely delight in the sight of her breaking down entirely. "Excuse me," she managed to say, her voice barely steady, before turning and pushing her way through the gathering crowd, desperate to find some corner of the vast hall where she might escape the weight of so many judging eyes. She did not get far before her path was blocked, quite unexpectedly, by a tall figure stepping directly into her way. She looked up, startled, and found herself face to face with Duke Alastair Ashbourne himself, close enough now to see the sharp intelligence in his gray eyes, the firm set of his jaw, the quiet seriousness that seemed to radiate from him even amid the chaos of the moment. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. The whispers around them seemed to fade into background noise as Alara stood frozen, painfully aware of her exposed shoulder, of the torn fabric, of the humiliation still burning hot across her face. Then, without a single word of explanation, Duke Alastair Ashbourne reached up, unclasped the dark velvet cloak from around his own shoulders, and draped it gently over Alara, covering the torn gown completely, shielding her from the sea of curious and judgmental eyes surrounding them. The cloak was warm, heavy with the faint scent of cedar and rain, and Alara felt, for the first time all evening, something like safety settle over her exposed shoulders. "There," Alastair said quietly, his voice calm and steady, carrying just enough that those nearby could hear him clearly. "Much better." The whispers around them faltered, uncertain now how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. Priscilla, who had been watching with quiet satisfaction only moments before, now stood frozen, her triumphant expression collapsing into something closer to panic as she realized the very public nature of what had just occurred. Alara looked up at the Duke, utterly speechless, unable to fully comprehend what had just happened. "Your Grace, I could not possibly." "You could and you shall," Alastair interrupted gently, though there was quiet steel beneath the softness of his tone. "No guest of mine will stand humiliated in my own home, while I do nothing to prevent it." He turned then, his sharp gaze sweeping across the gathered crowd, lingering pointedly on Priscilla and Lady Constance, who had by now pushed her way closer, her earlier composure entirely abandoned in favor of visible alarm. "I would be very interested," Alastair said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent ballroom, "to hear precisely how this young woman's gown came to be torn before she ever arrived at my door." Nobody spoke. The musicians, sensing the shift in atmosphere, allowed their song to trail off into uncertain silence. Every eye in the vast hall now turned, not toward Alara, but toward Lady Constance and her daughters, awaiting an explanation that none of them seemed eager to provide. Lady Constance's mouth opened and closed once before she managed to find her voice, though it came out far less steady than her usual commanding tone. "Your Grace, I am certain there has simply been some unfortunate accident. Girls can be careless with their dresses, especially when excitement runs high before such an important event." "An accident?" Alastair repeated evenly, his gaze steady and unblinking. "I see. And which of your daughters was responsible for this particular accident?" Silence stretched through the hall, heavy and uncomfortable. Priscilla's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence entirely evaporated beneath the weight of the Duke's calm, unwavering attention. Margaret stared fixedly at the floor, clearly unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. Alara, still wrapped in the warmth of the Duke's cloak, felt an unfamiliar mixture of emotions swirling through her chest. Part of her wanted nothing more than to disappear entirely, to avoid the discomfort of being the center of such public attention. But another part of her, a part that had been silenced for 3 long years, felt something close to vindication at finally seeing her stepfamily's cruelty exposed in front of witnesses who could not simply be dismissed or ignored. "It does not matter," Alara said quietly, surprising herself as much as anyone else nearby. "What is done is done. I would rather enjoy the rest of the evening than dwell further on it." Alastair turned to look at her, something shifting in his expression, a flicker of genuine respect replacing the earlier hardness. "As you wish," he said. Then, after a brief pause, he added, "Though I do hope you will allow me the honor of a dance if you feel equal to it." The unexpected request rippled through the surrounding crowd, murmurs of surprise and speculation rising immediately. A duke, known throughout the county for his reluctance toward courtship, was publicly requesting a dance with a young woman standing before him in a borrowed cloak, her own gown visibly damaged beneath it. Alara felt her cheeks warm, though this time not from humiliation. "I would be honored, Your Grace." Alastair offered his arm, and Alara, still wrapped securely in his cloak, accepted it, allowing him to lead her toward the center of the dance floor as the musicians, taking their cue from the shifting mood of the room, began a new, gentler melody. As they began to dance, Alara was acutely aware of every eye in the ballroom following their movements, though the Duke's steady presence beside her made the attention feel somehow less overwhelming than it had only moments before. "You did not need to do that," Alara said quietly as they moved through the steps of the dance. "Though I am deeply grateful that you did." "I did what any decent host would do," Alastair replied, though something in his tone suggested it was more than mere hospitality that had prompted his actions. "Cruelty should never go unanswered, especially not within my own home." "Not everyone would have noticed," Alara said, "or cared enough to intervene." Alastair was quiet for a moment, his gray eyes studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch slightly. "I noticed you the moment you walked through those doors," he admitted, "long before your shawl was pulled away. There was something in the way you carried yourself, despite everything, that I found difficult to look away from." Alara did not quite know how to respond to such an admission, so unexpected from a man known throughout the county for his reserved, distant nature. "I did not expect kindness tonight," she said honestly. "Not after everything that happened before I even arrived." "Tell me," Alastair said gently, "what happened." And so, as they continued to move gracefully across the dance floor, Alara found herself sharing pieces of her story, carefully at first, then with growing openness as she realized the Duke was truly listening, his expression neither pitying nor judgmental, simply attentive. She told him of her father's death, of the slow erosion of her place within her own household, of her mother's gown discovered in the attic trunk, mended by candlelight over 3 quiet nights. Alastair listened without interruption, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly at certain details, though he said nothing further about Lady Constance or her daughters until the dance drew to its natural conclusion. Your father sounds as though he was a remarkable man, Alastair said finally, as the music faded and they came to a gentle stop near the edge of the dance floor. He was, Alara said softly. I only wish he could see how far things have fallen since he has been gone. Perhaps, Alastair said, tonight marks the beginning of things rising again, rather than continuing to fall. Before Alara could respond, Edmund Faircroft appeared at the Duke's side, his expression carefully neutral though his eyes carried unmistakable curiosity as he glanced between his employer and the young woman still wrapped in the Duke's own cloak. Your Grace, Edmund said quietly, I have gathered the information you requested earlier. Alastair nodded, then turned back to Alara. Would you excuse me for just a moment? I promise I will return shortly. Alara nodded, watching as the Duke stepped aside with his advisor, their conversation too quiet for her to overhear, though she noticed Edmund glancing back toward Lady Constance and her daughters more than once during their brief exchange. Lucy appeared at Alara's side almost immediately, her eyes wide with barely contained excitement. Alara, do you have any idea what just happened? The Duke danced with you, publicly, after defending you in front of the entire ballroom. I am still trying to understand it myself, Alara admitted, glancing down at the fine cloak still wrapped around her shoulders, hiding the torn gown beneath. Whatever happens next, Lucy said, squeezing her hand warmly, I do not think anyone in this room will forget what they witnessed tonight, least of all your stepfamily. Across the hall, Lady Constance stood rigid with barely contained fury, watching as whispers continued to spread among the gathered guests, each retelling of the evening's events growing more elaborate with every passing moment. Priscilla stood beside her mother, arms crossed tightly, her earlier triumph now replaced entirely with mounting dread as she realized the full scope of the social damage this evening might inflict upon their family's reputation. This is not over, Priscilla muttered under her breath, though even she seemed uncertain, for the first time, whether that statement held any real power behind it anymore. When Alastair returned to Alara's side, his expression had shifted slightly, something more purposeful settling into his features. I have asked Edmund to arrange for a private carriage to take you home this evening, whenever you are ready to leave. There is no need to wait for your stepfamily's departure. That is very generous, Alara said, though I would not wish to trouble you further. It is no trouble at all, Alastair replied. In truth, I would prefer to know you are traveling safely, rather than risking another long walk through the dark on foot. Alara's eyes widened slightly. How did you know I walked here? A faint, almost boyish smile touched the corner of Alastair's mouth, the first genuine smile Alara had seen from him all evening. Edmund has a talent for gathering information quickly. He spoke with the man delivering cider barrels earlier this evening, who mentioned giving a young woman a ride the final stretch of the journey. Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks, embarrassed at how thoroughly her circumstances had apparently become known, yet strangely touched that the Duke had taken the trouble to learn more about her situation at all. Nathaniel, she said. He was very kind to me. Then I shall see that his kindness does not go unrewarded, Alastair said simply, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to reward a stranger's small act of decency. The remainder of the evening passed differently than Alara could ever have anticipated when she first stepped through the doors of Ashbourne Manor, torn gown hidden beneath a borrowed shawl. She danced twice more with the Duke, spoke at length with Lucy and several other genuinely kind guests, and found herself, for the first time in 3 long years, laughing freely without the constant weight of dread pressing against her chest. Priscilla and Margaret kept their distance for the remainder of the night, though Alara caught glimpses of them occasionally, standing stiffly near the edges of the room, engaged in increasingly strained conversation with their mother. Whatever plans Lady Constance had once held for securing advantageous matches for her daughters, this evening seemed to have crumbled entirely beneath the weight of the scandal now spreading rapidly through the gathered guests. As the evening drew toward its close and guests began gradually departing into the cool night air, Alastair walked Alara personally to the private carriage he had arranged, still wrapped in his own cloak, which he insisted she keep for the journey home. "Thank you," Alara said, pausing at the carriage door, "for everything you did tonight. I do not think I fully understand yet what changed, but I know that something has." "Perhaps," Alastair said quietly, "we might discover together exactly what that change means, if you would permit me to call upon you properly, once matters have settled." Alara looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, any hint that his interest might fade as quickly as it had appeared. She found none. Only quiet, steady sincerity, the same quality she had glimpsed in him from the very first moment their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. "I would like that very much," she said. Alastair helped her into the carriage, closing the door gently behind her, and as the horses began to pull away down the long, lantern-lit drive, Alara looked back once toward the golden glow of Ashbourne Manor, still humming with music and laughter beneath the night sky. She thought of the torn gown hidden beneath the Duke's warm cloak, of the long, cold walk that had brought her here, of the kindness of a stranger with cider barrels, of the courage it had taken to walk through those doors despite everything her stepfamily had done to stop her. For the first time since her father's death, Alara Whitmore felt something she had almost forgotten was possible. She felt hope. The carriage ride home passed quickly, the countryside slipping by in peaceful darkness, and by the time Alara arrived back at the house that had felt, for 3 long years, more like a prison than a home, she found herself surprisingly calm, even as she prepared for whatever confrontation might await her stepfamily's eventual return. She changed out of her mother's torn gown carefully, folding it with the same tenderness she had shown while mending it, and laid it gently across her bed. Tomorrow, she decided, she would begin repairing it properly, not out of necessity this time, but simply because it deserved to be restored to the beauty it once held, the same beauty her mother had carried so gracefully so many years ago. She kept the Duke's cloak draped over the chair beside her window, and as she finally settled into bed, exhausted but strangely at peace, her thoughts drifted back to gray eyes that had looked at her not with pity, but with genuine respect. Whatever came next, Alara realized as sleep finally claimed her, she would not face it alone anymore. News of what had happened at Ashbourne Manor traveled faster than Alara could have imagined possible. By the following afternoon, the story had already reached the market square, whispered between vendors and shoppers alike, growing more detailed and more scandalous with each retelling. By the day after that, it had spread to neighboring villages, carried along by travelers and tradesmen who had either witnessed the events themselves or heard them recounted by someone who had. The story, as it traveled, took on a life of its own. Some versions claimed Lady Constance had torn the gown herself out of jealousy. Others insisted the Duke had declared his intentions to marry Alara on the spot, right there in the middle of the ballroom. Though neither version was entirely accurate, the core truth remained unmistakable and undeniable, spreading through the county with unstoppable momentum. A stepmother and her daughters had cruelly humiliated a grieving young woman, and the Duke of Ashbourne himself had stepped forward to defend her. The consequences for Lady Constance and her daughters arrived swiftly and without mercy. Invitations that had once flowed steadily into their household came to an abrupt halt. Acquaintances who had once eagerly sought their company now found convenient reasons to avoid their presence entirely. The advantageous matches Lady Constance had spent months carefully arranging for Priscilla and Margaret quietly withdrew their interest, one by one, as word of the family's cruelty continued to spread. Priscilla, who had always thrived on social standing and admiration, found the sudden shift almost unbearable. She spent the days following the ball in a state of barely contained fury, alternating between blaming Alara for the entire situation and blaming her own mother for failing to prevent it. Margaret, by contrast, grew increasingly quiet and withdrawn, the weight of her own complicity settling heavily upon her conscience in a way she had not anticipated. "I never wanted this," Margaret admitted quietly one evening, finding Alara alone in the kitchen, mending the final torn seam of her mother's gown by candlelight. I did not tear the gown myself, but I did nothing to stop it either. I have thought of little else since that night. Alara looked up from her work, studying her stepsister carefully. She had spent 3 years learning to expect nothing but cruelty from this household, and Margot's unexpected honesty caught her entirely off guard. "Why are you telling me this now?" Alara asked. "Because I am tired," Margot said simply, "of being cruel simply because it was easier than being kind. I watched you walk into that house tonight wrapped in the Duke's cloak, and I realized how small our cruelty truly was compared to the dignity you carried despite it." Alara set down her needle, considering her stepsister's words carefully. She did not fully trust this sudden change of heart, not after 3 years of careful, calculated unkindness, but something in Margot's expression seemed genuinely different, genuinely troubled by her own past behavior. "I forgive you," Alara said finally, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "Not because what happened did not hurt, but because carrying anger toward you any longer would only continue to hurt me more than it hurts you." Margot's eyes filled with unexpected tears. "I do not deserve such kindness." "Perhaps not," Alara agreed gently. "But I have decided I would rather offer kindness I do not owe than continue living in the bitterness I was given." The days following the ball brought other changes as well, changes far more welcome than the tension simmering between Alara and her stepfamily. True to his word, Duke Alastair Ashbourne called upon Alara properly within the week, arriving at the house in a formal carriage, dressed in fine but understated clothing, carrying with him a small bouquet of white roses that reminded Alara instantly of her mother's favorite garden flowers. Lady Constance, who had initially planned to refuse the Duke entry entirely, found herself with little choice but to receive him graciously once his carriage arrived, aware that any further scandal could only worsen the family's already damaged reputation. Alastair sat with Alara in the modest drawing room, the same room where the invitation had first been read aloud weeks earlier, and their conversation flowed easily, comfortably, as though the connection formed between them at the ball had only continued to deepen in the days since. "I have thought of little else besides our conversation at the ball," Alastair admitted, once Lady Constance had reluctantly excused herself to allow them a measure of privacy. "Your strength in the face of everything you described left a deep impression on me." "I have thought of you as well," Alara admitted honestly, "though I confess I did not expect a duke to remain interested in someone whose own family treats her so poorly." "Your family's treatment of you," Alastair said firmly, "reflects entirely upon their character and not at all upon yours. If anything, the grace with which you have endured such treatment only speaks further to the kind of woman I believe you to be." Their courtship, once begun, progressed steadily over the following weeks. Alastair called upon Alara regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, more often simply bringing his genuine, attentive company, listening carefully as Alara spoke of her father's business, her mother's memory, her own quiet dreams for a future she had long ago stopped believing might include any real happiness. In turn, Alara learned more of Alastair's own history, of the sudden loss of his parents that had thrust the full weight of the dukedom onto his shoulders at far too young an age, of the loneliness that had followed him through years of careful, isolated duty. She began to understand that the cold, distant reputation he carried throughout the county was not born of arrogance, but of grief carried quietly and privately, much as her own grief had been carried through years of silence within her stepfamily's household. 3 months after the ball, Alastair arrived at the Whitmore household on a bright, clear afternoon, requesting a private audience with Alara in the modest garden behind the house, the same garden where Alara had once played as a small child alongside her mother. Alara met him there, curious at the seriousness in his expression, though she felt no fear, only quiet anticipation of whatever he had come to say. "I have spent these past months," Alastair began, standing among the early blooming roses, "trying to understand exactly what drew me to you so completely, from the very first moment I saw you standing at the entrance of that ballroom. I have concluded that it was never simply your kindness, though that quality remains undeniable. It was your strength, your refusal to be diminished, no matter how thoroughly others attempted to diminish you. Alara felt her heart quicken, though she remained silent, allowing him to continue. I have lived these past 5 years believing that duty alone was enough to fill a life, Alistair continued. That the dukedom, the responsibilities, the endless obligations could somehow replace the connection I lost when my parents passed. I was wrong. You have shown me, in these few short months, exactly what I have been missing. He reached into his coat and produced a small, elegant box, opening it to reveal a delicate ring, simple in design but clearly crafted with great care. Alara Whitmore, he said, I am not asking you to become a duchess simply for the sake of title or position. I am asking you to build a life alongside me, one built on genuine partnership and respect, the same qualities your father clearly instilled within you, and the same qualities I hope to offer you in return. Will you marry me? Alara's eyes filled with tears, though this time they were tears of overwhelming joy rather than the sorrow that had defined so much of her recent life. She thought of her father, of how proud he would have been to witness this moment. She thought of her mother's gown, fully restored now, hanging carefully in her wardrobe, a symbol of everything she had endured and everything she had refused to let be destroyed. Yes, she said, her voice steady and certain. Yes, I will marry you. Alistair slipped the ring gently onto her finger, and as he did, Alara felt, for the first time in 3 long years, that her life was no longer defined by loss and cruelty, but by the promise of genuine, lasting happiness. News of the engagement spread through the county, even faster than news of the ball itself had traveled. Lady Constance, upon learning that her once dismissed stepdaughter was set to become the next Duchess of Ashbourne, found herself forced to navigate an entirely new set of social calculations, her earlier cruelty now standing as a permanent stain upon her family's reputation, one that no amount of careful diplomacy could fully erase. Priscilla, in particular, struggled to accept the sudden reversal of fortunes. The sister she had once tormented so thoroughly now stood, poised to become one of the most respected women in the entire region, while Priscilla's own prospects continued to dwindle beneath the weight of the scandal she herself had helped create. Margaret, however, chose a different path entirely. In the weeks following her private conversation with Alara in the kitchen, she had begun making quiet efforts to change, offering genuine apologies not just to Alara, but to others in the household she had treated poorly over the years. When Alara's wedding preparations began in earnest, it was Margaret who offered to help with the arrangements, her assistance genuine and freely given, without any expectation of reward. I know I do not deserve to be part of this happiness, Margaret said one afternoon, as she helped Alara select fabric samples for the wedding gown. But I am grateful you have allowed me to try to make amends. Everyone deserves the chance to become better than their past mistakes, Alara replied gently. I am simply glad you chose to take that chance. The wedding itself took place on a warm summer morning, in the same gardens at Ashbourne Manor where guests had once gathered for the fateful ball that had changed everything. Alara wore her mother's gown, fully restored, the ivory silk gleaming beautifully in the morning sunlight, every careful stitch a testament to resilience, memory, and love that could never truly be destroyed. Nathaniel, the kind cart driver who had offered Alara a ride on that cold, lonely road months earlier, attended as an honored guest, having become close friends with both Alara and Alistair in the months since that fateful night. Lucy stood beside Alara as well, her closest friend and confidant, beaming with genuine happiness throughout the entire ceremony. As Alara and Alistair exchanged their vows beneath a canopy of white roses, surrounded by friends both old and newly found, Alara felt the weight of 3 difficult years finally lift from her shoulders entirely. She thought of her father, of her mother, of every painful moment that had led her to this single, radiant point in her life, and she understood with complete certainty that every struggle had ultimately led her exactly where she was always meant to be. Lady Constance and Priscilla attended the ceremony as well, though their presence remained strained and largely silent throughout the celebration. Whatever bitterness lingered between them and Alara would take considerably longer to heal, if it ever fully healed at all. But Alara found that she no longer carried the same weight of resentment she once had. Her happiness, secured through genuine love and hard-won resilience, no longer depended upon their approval or their remorse. As the wedding celebration continued late into the warm summer evening, music filling the gardens with joyful melody, Alara found herself standing beside Alistair near the very spot where he had first draped his cloak over her exposed shoulder months earlier. "Do you remember," she asked softly, "what you said to me that night right before we danced for the first time?" Alistair smiled, pulling her gently closer. "I believe I said something about hoping we might discover together exactly what had changed." "And have we discovered it?" Alara asked. "I believe we have," Alistair replied, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "Everything." A year passed quickly at Ashbourne Manor, filled with a warmth and purpose that Alara had once believed she would never experience again. As Duchess, she found herself embracing responsibilities she had never expected to hold, overseeing charitable efforts throughout the county, establishing a small fund dedicated to supporting young women who had lost their families and found themselves, as she once had, without resources or protection. She thought often of Nathaniel's kindness on that cold, dark road, and made certain that his own family never wanted for anything again. A small repayment for a debt that had, in truth, changed the entire course of her life. Alistair proved himself, day after day, exactly the partner Alara had hoped he would become. The dukedom flourished under their combined leadership, its tenants and workers treated with a fairness and respect that had been sorely lacking during the isolated years following his parents' passing. Together, they hosted gatherings far different from the tense, calculated social events of years past, evenings filled with genuine warmth and laughter rather than empty ambition. Margaret visited often, her relationship with Alara growing steadily stronger with each passing month, the guilt of her earlier cruelty gradually replaced by genuine, hard-earned friendship. She eventually found happiness of her own, marrying a kind, gentle merchant she met through Alara's charitable work, a man who valued her honesty and her willingness to grow far more than any title or fortune could ever measure. Priscilla's path proved considerably more difficult. Stripped of the social standing she had once relied upon so heavily, she struggled for years to find genuine contentment, her bitterness slow to fade even as circumstances around her continued to change. Yet even she eventually found her way toward a quieter, more honest life, humbled by years of consequence that had followed directly from choices she alone had made on that fateful night. Lady Constance, in her later years, found herself increasingly isolated, the social connections she had once valued above all else proving far less loyal than she had ever imagined. Though Alara never fully reconciled with her stepmother, she made certain, in quiet acts of unspoken generosity, that Lady Constance never faced true hardship in her old age, a kindness offered not out of obligation, but simply because Alara had chosen, long ago, to build her life upon compassion rather than bitterness. Years later, when Alara's own daughter asked her, curled beside the fire on a cold winter evening, to tell the story of how she had met her father, Alara would always begin the same way, her voice warm with memory rather than pain. She would tell of a torn gown and a lonely road, of a kind stranger with barrels of cider, and a friend found unexpectedly in a crowded ballroom. She would tell of humiliation faced with quiet dignity, and of a stranger's cloak offered without hesitation, a single act of kindness that had changed the entire course of her life. "Sometimes," Alara would tell her daughter, tucking the blankets warmly around her, "the hardest moments of our lives carry within them the seeds of everything wonderful still waiting to unfold. The key is simply refusing to let cruelty convince you that you are anything less than exactly who you truly are." Outside, snow would fall softly over the gardens of Ashbourne Manor, the same gardens where Alara had once exchanged her wedding vows beneath a canopy of white roses, and where, years earlier, a torn ivory gown had first caught the attention of a lonely duke standing quietly beside a marble pillar. watching a young woman walk through crowded doors with her chin lifted high, utterly unbroken despite everything the world had tried to take from her. And every single time she told the story, Alara Whitmore, now Duchess of Ashbourne, felt the same quiet gratitude she had carried since that unforgettable night. Gratitude not simply for the love she had found, but for the strength she had discovered within herself long before Alastair Ashbourne ever draped his cloak over her shoulders. It was, she often reflected, the truest gift her difficult years had ultimately given her. Not simply a title, or a grand estate, or even the love of a good and honorable man, but the unshakable knowledge that her own worth had never depended upon anyone else's cruelty, or anyone else's approval at all. It had been hers all along, waiting patiently to be reclaimed.